Now, the ANC believes the declaration of the state of disaster will help South Africa end rolling blackouts by the end of the year. President Ramaphosa has told the nation they'll explore the legal frameworks of what a national state of disaster would entail. But Professor Dewald van Niekerk, that's the head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at the Northwest University, believes the energy crisis is more of a governance issue, which the Disaster Act doesn't provide for. Professor van Niekerk joins me now for this very conversation. Professor, good morning and thank you very much for your time. You know, this is a very difficult time for South Africans. Many were calling for a state of disaster. Now that is a real possibility. Some of them are backtracking, thinking funds could be looted. But we'll park that one for a bit and start with just the Disaster Management Act itself as a legislative instrument. Is it in fact ideal as an instrument to rid the country of load shedding in a year, as we're told?
Good morning, Funda and viewers. Thank you for the opportunity. The Disaster Management Act is extremely specific when it comes to the declaration of a national state of disaster or any state of disaster as such. And the intent of the Act was never to allow for governance failures and failures in development. It is much more focused on issues of preventing a situation for escalating into a disaster, in other words, disaster risk reduction measures. And then if we sit in a perilous situation, implement extraordinary measures. As you rightfully said, I don't believe that the Disaster Management Act is the correct legal instrument that we need to be using in this case for various reasons. And one of them relates to the abuse of power that goes with the declaration of the state of disaster. And also, if we consider what Ms. Mbalula said and what the ministers have said and what President Ramaphosa have said, I'm not convinced that they can't do what they want to do by just using the normal state mechanism that makes provision for everything that they want to achieve.
Would it not be a multi-pronged approach that here, if they're saying to us it will take a year to rid us of load shedding, it would not merely just be the state of disaster?
No, it won't. The reason why you would declare a national state of disaster is to mobilize extraordinary resources that you don't have access to normally. I want to ask the question, where will these extraordinary resources all of a sudden come from? If we have to reprioritize government budgets to be doing this, we can already do that. We have the mechanism to do that. If we implement a state of disaster, we do it according to the Disaster Management Act. It's very specific in saying we do a declaration for 3 months. After that, we can renew it for 30 days. I think coming out of COVID, everyone's well aware of how this mechanism works. Now the government is saying we are going to declare or use 11 months period. So they are already saying for the next 11 months, we will find ourselves in a state of disaster. Therefore, they're already preempting the 4th, 5th, 6 months, etc., where this will be extended. That is in itself a huge red flag when it comes to a piece of legislation.
I want to take you back to that point you made about funding, where it will come from. It's a very important point to discuss a bit further. You're saying that here what we're looking to do is cut the red tape and deregulation in this instance, but you're saying beyond the red tape, where would the funds come from to secure the energy? Because right now, we actually have been struggling, Treasury has been struggling to advance money for diesel. So there would be fast tracking to where? Is that
Exactly.
what you're saying?
Yes, I mean, under a state of disaster, you can access the contingency reserve. Coming out of COVID, I'm asking the question, how much do we have left in the contingency reserve? Or is this a bottomless pit of money that government is printing for us? They're not open and transparent when it comes to this. Normally, in any other given situation, we have a natural hazard escalating and possibly becoming a disaster. You could call on the international community to come and assist you in a situation of that nature. But this is something totally different. This is something that's been coming since 2008. It is very difficult and I think almost impossible for government to now argue for international funds because all of a sudden they call it a disaster. I think what the irony behind this is, by saying we want a state of disaster for this, the president and his cabinet are acknowledging the fact that they have no other recourse. They have no idea what to do further. They've actually lost control not only over Eskom, but of the internal processes. Surely, as the president, and in the situation that we find ourselves now in, He can relook at his cabinet. He can deploy other people. You can get them to make decisions. You can get your BDGs and your DGs to make decisions and to fast-track so many things and cut the red tape. Why do you need a state of disaster for this? I think it goes a bit beyond this, and we probably need to read between the lines. If we extend this for 11 months, we're getting close into next year, and we're going into an election year as well. There's so many things that the ANC can do where there won't be oversight through Parliament. And what if we enter into 2024 and they use a state of disaster to influence something like the election or the election date? This, to me, just raises too many red flags in a democracy to be a sound decision.
So you're mostly concerned that on principle it's probably not sound, particularly because you believe this can be attributed to misgovernance, the crisis that we're in right now. But if we had to look at the Act itself, I read the Act, and a disaster as defined in the Act is an occurrence that is progressive or sudden. Ours is indeed progressive. It can be widespread or localized. Ours is widespread. And it can be natural or human caused. And ours is human caused. So we meet three aspects of the definition of the disaster. So in that part, can we agree that, yes, indeed, what we're going through right now, this crisis, can actually be referred to as a disaster? We meet the criteria.
No. For the simple reason is that the Disaster Management Act is linked to a progression of a specific hazard. In other words, something like that might be natural, anthropogenic, something like a flood. It is geographically based. It is something that we can study. It is something that we understand the characteristics of. Something like COVID, very similarly, it's much on a global scale, but it's something very specific that we can study. This does not allow for what we now see. I think it is basically just going to be an abuse of power to once again use a mechanism that does not allow for oversight in decision making. And that's the only reason I see this. We sit with many crises. We shouldn't call everything a disaster and say this qualifies as a state of disaster. I'm sure if you go speak to local municipalities, many people will tell you the situation of the roads is a disaster. Are we going to declare that a national or a provincial or local state of disaster? If you look at the service delivery in certain municipalities, it is a disaster. You can't use a state of disaster to fix normal management and governance issues. This is not what the Act was written for. This is not what emergency and disaster law is there for. I believe they're just trying to use this as a scapegoat to fix problems, or seemingly fix problems, that they actually have no idea how to address them through the normal mechanism.
Yours is most certainly a very interesting perspective. But the other conversation now is that of Powership, where some are now saying this legal instrument would make it possible for Powership to provide the emergency energy. Do you believe that is possibly where we're headed?
It could be. Like I say, we're not quite sure what goes on within the inner workings of the ANC and how what they have in mind. But whether it is a state of disaster, as we've seen with COVID, it gives the government far-reaching powers to do whatever they want to. Therefore, they can, for instance, say we don't need to have environmental impact assessments. We're going to fast-track the use of car power ships or whatever thing. We're going to
do away with localization requirements. Yes.
It can be so many things that they can decide which would make sense and many that wouldn't make sense at all. It all depends on what's the hidden agenda behind this. It could also be, well, the ANC is broke. We need to get money somewhere for election campaign. Let's get the car power ships in. We get cutbacks so that we have money for election campaign. There's all these type of questions you can ask. Why do you need this? We certainly do not need this. We've had ample time and there's ample resources and skills in the country to fix the problem. We do have that. We know this. We've seen the projects. We've seen the proposals. We know what we have. There's a seemingly inability by government to be doing this. It's as if the ANC government wants to go at this alone. They don't want to take hands with opposition parties or the private sector. They just want to centralize power. And this, to me, is just another way of doing it. This is not a disaster management issue.
Professor, thank you very much for your insights this morning. That was Dewald van Niekerk, a professor in geography and head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at the Northwest University.